Please be seated. Thank you. Thank you. Well, it's a real honor to be with you tonight, and I hope I do not add to the problem of pain as I speak on this particular subject. The good news is that after I finish speaking on it as best as I can within the time that we have on hand, I'm going to be joined by two of my colleagues, Dr. Vince Vitale, who is a lecturer at Wycliffe Hall and Oxford University. He did his studies at Princeton and his doctoral work at Oxford. You'll hear more from him about him later. And Dr. Nabil Qureshi, who is actually also on our team. He is a medical doctor, but has also acquired a couple of postgraduate degrees in theological training and text of scripture and so on. They will tell you more about them as they come onto the platform, but I think it's wonderful for me to have them, at least for a couple of reasons. Number one, anything that I say that makes sense, I'll be glad to answer your questions about those. If it doesn't make sense, they will be answering the questions on those. For a couple of reasons. Vince Vitale, when he was at Princeton, then at Oxford, was not only a student of philosophy, but also was a light welterweight boxing competitor there, did extremely well. And anyone who has been in the business of inflicting pain ought to be able to justify it as to why that was done. And Nabil Qureshi, as a medical doctor, would have been on the other side of the ring, catering to the needs of the one that was felled. So he'll give you justifiable reasons for why he alleviates pain. Looking at two of them, I'm really glad they're here. And in all seriousness, I think you will find our time of interaction to be very, very meaningful. We come off various itineraries from different parts of the world and different kinds of audiences, and everyone knows that this is possibly the most daunting question that challenges any theistic framework, but also any naturalistic framework, because both worldviews have to explain, in the former case, how the doctrine that they hold to in terms of the existence of an all-powerful and an all-loving God can allow the kind of evil and suffering that we experience in the world. But from the counter perspective, those who deny the existence of God on the basis of such suffering then have to find a way to explain moral reasoning. Both of them have tried it. I'm not sure that I have found the answer from the counter perspective very convincing. People like Daniel Dennett and Hitchens and Dawkins and Sam Harris. Sam Harris particularly has written most recently on the subject, and Daniel Dennett goes to great lengths in his interviews to point out what he will call the evidential problem with the existence of God, namely the problem of evil, the problem of pain, and the problem of suffering. So with that as a backdrop, hopefully we will touch some of these authors as we go along, and certainly in the question and answer time, I hope we will do our best to interact with you. Let me just say that as a speaker and one who talks on themes such as these, although it's been a long time since this particular subject was assigned to me, certainly it comes from the floor, no matter what the subject is in the defense of theism, that we're fully aware of how tough these questions are. Anyone who minimizes it obviously doesn't understand the question. And sometimes I get the feeling when those who attack theism or the Christian faith in particular seem to think that we're sort of foolish in ignoring this problem. We actually don't ignore it. Daniel Dennett, referring to Alvin Plantinga and his debate with the great philosopher Plantinga, said, well, his argument was very logical, but his belief is preposterous. Now, that's interesting, isn't it? So making a value judgment after actually denying that values actually exist. Quite pronounced, quite dramatic. But both sides feel the struggle, and every worldview wrestles with this. In fact, it has been rightly said that virtue in distress and vice in triumph often makes atheists of mankind. Virtue in distress and vice in triumph often makes atheists of mankind. Andrew Fletcher, the 18th century Scottish political activist, said this: "Let me write the songs of a nation. I don't care who writes its laws. Let me write the songs of a nation. I don't care who writes its laws. And the reason Fletcher said that was that while reason and logic and argument may come to you from the front door of rationality, music and the arts often come through the back door of the imagination. And that's why sometimes my work at Cambridge University was in really the Romantic poets. And when I see how poetry and music and the arts so often raise the question in very thorny ways, they sometimes even hint at the answer that oftentimes those who are given to pure reasoning do not even move in that direction. The famed music group Moody Blues said this: "Why do we never get an answer when we're knocking at the door with 1,000 million questions about hate and death and war? Because when we stop and look around us, there's nothing that we need in a world of persecution that is whirling in its greed. Why do we never get an answer when we're knocking at the door?" That is the musician raising it. And any time you see the problem raised, you begin to see how easy it is to give a long list of tragedies and atrocities as if we're in need of justifying that evil and suffering really exist. What I want to do is try to illustrate for you this evening that not only do we feel it, not only do we wrestle with it, not only do we argue our way through it and debate it in our own minds, but I've come to the conclusion that the problem of evil is better stated as a mystery rather than a problem. Why do I say that? I believe a problem is very easy to describe. I think it was Gabriel Marcel who said that a mystery is a problem that encroaches upon itself because the questioner becomes the object of the question. So in a mystery, when it encroaches upon itself and you are part of the very question being raised, that becomes harder to answer. But a problem is easier to deal with. As someone said, getting to Mars is a problem, falling in love is a mystery. So let me repeat what Marcel says. A mystery is a problem that encroaches upon itself because the questioner becomes the object of the question. You and I are not outside of this question. We are in the question itself. I remember a medical doctor in the Middle East once describing to me how shocked he was to go through the experience of a heart attack, and he is a pain management specialist. He said, "Ravi, I realized when I was in the throes of that heart attack how difficult it was to describe it." He said, when a person says, "My arm is hurting, my leg is hurting, my head is hurting," it is as if whatever you are describing is experiencing pain is an appendage and something attached to the essential you. He said, when I was going through the heart attack, the only way to describe it was that I was in the pain. I was in the pain. The very organ that was intended to generate life instead was generating pain for me. And the problem of evil, I believe, is pretty much the same. Let's look at it first, the reality of it. David Hume, the skeptic, put it this way: were a stranger to suddenly drop into this world, I would show him as a specimen of its ills, a hospital full of diseases, a prison crowded with malefactors and debtors, a field strewn with carcasses, a fleet floundering in the ocean, a nation languishing under tyranny, famine, or pestilence. Honestly, I don't see how you can possibly square with the ultimate purpose of love. Interesting that the skeptic raises the question with a varieties of pain and suffering and then brings it to a closing statement on trying to square it with the ultimate purpose of love. Another existentialist put it this way: it is not science that has led me to doubt the purpose of God. It is the state of this world. It is this pitiless, unending struggle for existence among the nations. It is the collapse of our idealisms before the brute facts of force and chaos. that there is a radical twist in the very constitution of the universe which will always defeat man's hopes, make havoc of his dreams, and bring his pathetic optimism crashing in disaster. Purpose, look at the world, and that settles it for me. Now notice the first one in raising the question interjects the possibility, the impossibility of squaring it with the purpose of love. The existentialist says, how can there really be any purpose in life if all that we see around us in this pitiless, unending struggle for existence? So it's not science that was knocking him off any belief. It was just the fact that there was such despair and meaninglessness in the world that he saw around him. But second is the universality of the problem. Gautama Buddha, in moving away from being born a Hindu and in search of answers, looking at suffering and looking at old age, looking at death, looking at these sights as he was raised in a palace, left the palatial precincts and the comfort of it, ironically, on the very night that his first child, his son, was born. He left the palace, went away in search of answers to the problem of suffering. And by the way, the word he uses is the word dukkha, which is much more than the idea of pain or discomfort. Dukkha can best be described as an anguish that is so overwhelming to you, almost in the essential nature of who you are. So it's not mere philosophy. It's a struggle within that soulishness that is you, which is what Buddha was talking about. So he gave up his upbringing in Hinduism, renounced some of the teachings of the Vedas and the whole idea of the caste system, and he went in search of enlightenment, and then came up with his eightfold path and the Four Noble Truths, the first one of which was all life is suffering. And his conclusion was, if you cease to desire, if you stop wanting, you will eliminate any suffering whatsoever. So Buddha went along that path, which tells you there's a universality to it. Now, I was raised in India. My ancestors were Orthodox Hindu priests from the deep south. And I find it very fascinating that India, which is so intensely religious, is also a country that has lived with a lot of suffering and a lot of deprivation. The songs that they sing, the music that's so often present in their movies will oftentimes talk of the pain and suffering. And yet, with that pain and suffering is that intense sense of religiosity. And yet, if you move through Europe and the West and come into the United States and so on, with all of the prosperity and all of the comforts, we are gradually becoming more atheistic all the time. Fascinating difference where cultures in the midst of pain have sought answers for the spirit. Those in the midst of greater comforts are walking away from belief in God. Is it because we're more intelligent than them? Better qualified, more degrees? Understand reality better than the great philosophers that have come from the East and continue to look at this as a struggle for the soul? So first is the reality, second is the universality, third is the complexity of the problem. You've got the metaphysical aspect of it. What is the source of it, which is what we wrestle with most here. Then there's the physical aspect of it, natural disasters. There's the moral aspect of it. How can an all-powerful and an all-loving God allow this? So metaphysically, physically, and morally, we struggle to find answers. But here it is. As we look at this, I want you to understand right from the beginning what has to be a framework from which we answer this question. However you answer it, there has to be a framework. And the framework is this. This is just one question that tries to define what ultimate reality is all about. But the question hinges on to many others. The moment you move in the direction of coming to a conclusion on this, for example, the staunch atheist who says there is no way to see the existence of an all-powerful, all-loving God, therefore this world is really godless, we have to find meaning and purpose in this very world. There's no way to sustain the existence of God. The question then comes for that person, how is this then inextricably not joined to the question of meaning? It ties in to the question of purpose and meaning. I'll tell you why. In saying that we experience suffering and evil, we are looking for a purpose to explain it. But then we conclude sometimes, the skeptic does, that there is no purpose to life itself. It actually creates a bigger conundrum when there is no ultimate purpose, why we need to find tiny little purposes after all, other than the justification of being purely pragmatic. C.S. Lewis put it in these words: when a ship goes on to the high seas, it has to answer 3 questions. Number 1, how to keep that ship from sinking. He said that's personal ethics. Number 2, how to keep from bumping into other ships. That is social ethics. He said, but the most important question is, why is the ship out there in the first place? That is essential ethics. Do you realize that for the skeptic, the most important question is unanswered? They can come up with sort of social ethics, sort of a construct we can create, or personal ethics, why it is not good for me to cheat you or lie to you if the species is to survive. But they've still not been able to give us what the purpose of life is all about. We're just here. Time plus matter plus chance. And so as I deal with it, I want to take on 3 challenges that come to the Christian theist or to the theist in general, and then give you what I consider the Judeo-Christian answer, at least in a series of steps. Number 1, it is this. The evidential challenge basically says that I cannot believe in God because of the presence of evil. There is too much evil, therefore there cannot be an ultimate, all-powerful being. I recall in my earlier days when I was starting out speaking at the University of Nottingham. It was in the middle of my whole series of lectures, and I was talking once on the search for meaning. And a fellow stood up right at the back and he said, just shouted out at me, he said, there's too much of evil, too much of evil. There simply cannot be a God. So I said, can I interact with you for a moment? So he remained standing. I said, sir, when you say there's evil, aren't you assuming there's such a thing as good? He says, yeah. I said, when you say there's such a thing as good, aren't you assuming there's such a thing as a moral law on the basis of which to differentiate between good and evil? He paused and struggled with that a bit, sort of looking around and thinking. I said, let me help you here. I said, when Bertrand Russell was debating the philosopher Frederick Copleston, at one point Copleston looked at Russell and said to him, do you believe in good and bad? Do you believe there's such a thing as good and such a thing as bad? He said, yeah. He said, how do you differentiate between it? Bertrand Russell said the same way I differentiate between blue and green. Copleston said, wait a minute. You differentiate between blue and green by seeing, don't you? Russell said, yes. He said, how do you differentiate between good and bad? This great philosopher, mathematician gave this answer. On the basis of feeling. What else? Now, Copleston was a kind man. Somebody ought to have turned to Bertrand Russell and say, Mr. Russell, in some cultures they love their neighbors. In other cultures they eat them. Both on the basis of feeling. Do you have a personal preference? On the basis of feeling? Really? On the basis of feeling? So, he said, all right, I'll grant you there's such a thing as a moral law. So I said, when you say there's evil, you assume there's good. When you assume there's good, you're saying there's such a thing as a moral law on the basis of which to differentiate between good and evil. He said, all right, I'll grant you that. I said, but if you grant me a moral law, you must posit a moral lawgiver, because that's whom you're trying to disprove and not prove. Because if there's no moral lawgiver, there's no moral law. If there's no moral law, there's no good. If there's no good, there's no evil. What is your question? He stood there, eyeballed me and said, "What then am I asking you?" I said, "If you don't know, how am I supposed to help you with what it is you're asking me?" Now, let me be fair here. Somebody might pause and say, "Ravi, I'll grant you that there is evil and good. I might even stretch it a little bit and say, yeah, there are such things as moral laws." People like Dennett and Harris will sort of not go for the absolute, but they would certainly go for moral reasoning and moral thinking as something as having an ontic referent to by which we can make our judgments. But why do we have to have a moral lawgiver? And my answer to that is this: all questions about evil are either raised by a person or about a person. All questions on evil is either raised by a person or about a person, which means the questioner is making an incredible assumption that human beings have essential value, and that's what makes their question justifiable. That as a questioner, my question is valuable because I'm a person of value and have the right to raise it. Or the one I'm talking about in whose defense I have come, I am raising this because that person has essential value. Why do we argue for justice? Why do we come to the right, to the defense of the innocent? Because deep within us we believe that the person of value and worth ought not to be sacrificed at a whim. The essential value of human life is assumed in raising the question. And so the moral lawgiver has to be within the paradigm. If there is no moral lawgiver, I don't see how there is a moral law. If there is no moral law, there's no good. If there's no good, evil ultimately self-destructs. And the irony of it is, this is where some atheistic philosophers are being forced to get off. People like Dawkins and all, whom I might quote. But at the same time, the tension remains and the struggle remains. Let me position this for you with two illustrations. Vince Vitale and I are co-authoring a book, incidentally, on the problem of suffering. We're suffering through it right now, trying to work through it. And I was watching a BBC production on polar bears. Yeah, I do those things. I learned more from that than a lot of other stuff that goes on being idiotized in front of a box. So I may as well watch that. And so I was watching the BBC production on polar bears, and this polar bear wakes from its hibernation sleep, and its two young cubs are waiting to be fed, so it marches off. It's looking for food. And the ice is rather thin there, and he's making his way, but he gets to a pack of walruses, and he's eyeing for the youngest and the most baby walrus out there, and he spots one. But the bigger ones are aware that the predator is near, and so they're closing in a bit of a circle. Finally, with bounding strides, he leaps into their midst, desperately trying to get this baby walrus. The bigger ones are butting away at this polar bear. And the polar bear, ultimately unable to penetrate these defenses and gets bloodied in the process. The last scene is the polar bear turning and walking around back and digging its own grave. It does not now have the strength to make it all the way back to the cave. And you know, you look at it and your heart goes out. You're feeling sorry to see that happen. And the BBC commentator ends with this comment. He said, you know what? If there weren't any such thing as global warming, the polar bear would not have taken so long to get to its prey. And that's why we are responsible for the death of that polar bear. Wow. You almost feel like putting up your hand, coming forward, getting on your knees and say, dear polar bear, please forgive me for what I have just done to you. Now, here's what I want to say to you. Suppose he is right. Suppose he is right. Why didn't he blame the polar bear for oversleeping? If it had got up a couple of days earlier, maybe it would have had more strength and got some other kind of prey. Why didn't he look to the beastly world to find some kind of incrimination there? He goes to us. as human beings. You see, the inescapability of moral reasoning that comes around into the human heart, where you and I have to ask ourselves the question, if that is true, what responsibility must I bear for something like this? And I then have to take my personal responsibility in a world such as this. Second question, moving completely away to a different scene. My whole life has been surrounded by experiences that I never dreamed I would ever have. I don't know how many of you are even aware of my own journey spiritually. I was totally non-theistic, if not atheistic, growing up in this home, and I had no time for any of the religions in which I was raised. None. And at the age of 17, attempted to take my own life. And on that bed, when a Bible was brought to me, it's a long story, how my heart was changed, my life was turned. And subsequent to that, I never dreamed of all the experiences through which I was going to have to go in life to both enrich and to both plant questions within my mind in my pursuit of truth. I made my commitment to Christ at the age of 17. I speak to you now 50 years later. Is the most dramatic moment and the most incredible transformation that came about. And my father were here, he would tell you, of all my children, I never ever dreamed that this, my boy, would make anything out of his own life. And so traveling around, I sometimes watched things happen. When I was in my 20s, I was in Vietnam, also in Cambodia. I saw the horrors of war. I saw dreadful mangling of bodies taking place on the side of the highway. And I thought to myself, it's incredible, absolutely incredible what I'm witnessing. And in the 1980s, during the Cold War, I was in Auschwitz. If none of you has ever been to a death camp, it would be the most sobering trip of a lifetime to go and see one. Not a concentration camp, a death camp. I'd been to concentration camp, Birkenau, Buchenwald, Dachau, and all of those. I'd never been to a death camp, but I was speaking at the universities in Poland and was taken one day to see it. When I walked through the rooms and saw what humanity had done to its fellow human being, and at that time the most educated nation in the world, inflicted by the rhetoric and the power of one man who seemed to think there was a super race and a better race that could eliminate all the weak ones in the world and make this a better world for whoever survived, the strong ones. In one room, there was 14,000 pounds of women's hair stashed behind glass. Women who were scalped before they were taken into the gas rooms, to the rooms where the poison gas was just released through those jets, and as they were stacked up like animals, collapsing onto their knees, being obliterated in Auschwitz alone at the rate of 12,000 every day. One room with children upon whom Mengele performed his experiments. Standing there, castrated little boys like that. If you looked into their eyes, you were just staring at absolute emptiness. And Mengele was doing his scientific experiments on them. As the rock musician would say, knowledge is a deadly friend when no one sets the rules. The fate of all mankind, I see, was in the hands of fools. So he was doing it. And then I walked over to the gas ovens there, and I saw a sign by Adolf Hitler. I want to raise a generation of young people, devoid of a conscience, imperious, relentless, and cruel. Now here's the conundrum. Here's the difficulty. People like Dennett and Harris and all can pontificate on these ideas, how we can arrive at values. This is the whole search of Harris in his book, The Moral Landscape, that we have to solve this issue of value. Dennett in an interview keeps on repeating this thing. And he says, so long as we don't believe in absolutes. Well, that itself is an absolute statement. But apart from that, he comes through with this incredible comment at one point. He said, if within a culture you have certain values that you hold to, don't impose them on another culture. Isn't that an absolute? Isn't that an absolute?
Absolutely.
And so listen, here's what J.L. Mackie, the Australian atheist, says. Here's what he says. We might well argue that objective, intrinsically prescriptive features, supervenient upon natural ones, constitute so odd a cluster of qualities and relations that they are most unlikely to have arisen in the ordinary course of events without an all-powerful God to create them. The kind of configuration we need, says this atheist, to explain values and objectively, intrinsically prescriptive features, it's most unlikely to have arisen in the ordinary course of events without an all-powerful God to create them. And hence the atheist also, Michael Ruse, talking about the kind of answers that Harris and all give, he says illusionary answers. He said there is no way to get away from the fact that we struggle to explain moral reasoning. Think, for example, of what Kai Nielsen, the Canadian atheist, says. We have not been able to show that reason alone requires the moral point of view, or that really rational persons, unhoodwinked by myth or ideology, need not be individual egoists or classical amoralists. Reason doesn't decide here. The picture I have painted for you is not a pleasant one. Reflection on this really depresses me. Pure, practical reason, even with a good knowledge of the facts, will not take you to morality. It's an atheist. So where do we get off? We get off with Richard Dawkins. Here's what he says. In a universe of blind physical forces and genetic replication, some people are going to get hurt and other people are going to get lucky. And you won't find any rhyme or reason in it, nor any justice. The universe we observe has precisely the properties we should expect. If there is at the bottom no design, no purpose, no evil, and no good, nothing but blind, pitiless indifference, DNA neither knows nor cares. DNA just is, and we dance to its music. About 3-4 months ago, the Australian cricket team was in England, and they were playing these test matches, which last 5 days. People can never figure it out, how a match can last 5 days, but they do. If you love cricket, it's a foretaste of heaven. I enjoyed playing cricket. But there was an English cricketer by the name of Stuart Broad. He was at the crease batting, and he was out. The ball hit the bat, and he was caught behind by the catcher. He knew it, everybody knew it, but the umpire didn't see it. Because the umpire gave him not out. Now you have an appeal, but they had run out of their appeals, and the Australian cricket team could not appeal of that. And Broad, because of the few extra runs that he made afterwards, ended up being the difference between winning and losing. You should have seen the outrage of Richard Dawkins. He tweeted, "I'm ashamed of being an Englishman here," he said. "This is not cricket. He should have walked. Stuart Broad is a cheat." And he wasn't prepared for the huge deluge of tweets that came. Richard, it's okay. He's dancing to his DNA. Fascinating. You can dance to your DNA, but not when the other person is dancing to his, and you are the victim. I say to you what G.K. Chesterton said, all denunciation implies a moral doctrine of some kind. And the modern skeptic doubts not only the institution he denounces, but the doctrine by which he denounces it. So he writes one book complaining that imperial oppression insults the purity of women. Then he writes another book, a novel, in which he insults it himself. As a politician, he cries out that war is a waste of life. Then as a philosopher, that life itself is a waste of time. A Russian pessimist will denounce a policeman for killing a peasant, then prove by the highest philosophical principles that the peasant ought to have killed himself. A man denounces marriage as a lie, then denounces aristocratic profligates for treating it as a lie. The man of this school goes first to a political meeting where he complains that savages are treated as if they were beasts. Then he takes his hat and umbrella and goes on to a scientific meeting where he proves that they practically are beasts. In short, the modern revolutionist, being an infinite skeptic, is forever engaged in undermining his own minds. In his book on politics, he attacks men for trampling on morality. In his book on ethics, he attacks morality for trampling on men. Therefore, the modern man in revolt becomes practically useless for all purposes of revolt. By rebelling against everything, he's lost his right to rebel against anything. An infinite skeptic. So when you talk about the evidential problem, you have to end up where Dawkins says, there's no such thing really as evil. I asked a student at Oxford University after I gave a talk there some years ago, and he said, I don't believe in absolutes. And he was surrounded by a lot of students with him. And I said, can I ask you a question? If I take a 1-year-old baby on this platform and take a sharp butcher knife and I carved up that baby and chopped that baby up into pieces for my pure pleasure, do you think I would have done anything morally wrong? He paused, drew some design with his toe on the carpet, and then he looks at me and said, Mrs. Zacharias, I wouldn't like what you did, but I couldn't honestly say that what you did was morally wrong. And the same sound by the students standing there. Can you live existentially with that philosophy that there is no such thing as moral evil? Second attack, we can find biological reasons, sociological reasons by which we can arrive at this. I bring 2 counter-responses to that. Number 1, if it's only physical, if it's only biological, how do we ever explain supererogatory acts as acts of nobility? How do we ever explain supererogatory acts? What is a supererogatory act? Some years ago, Daniel Goleman, in his book Emotional Intelligence, told about Gary and Mary Jean Chauncey on the Amtrak train that went down in the South into the swirling waters, in which one compartment after another fell into those waters and several people were killed. My good friend R.C. Sproul was actually on that train. His was the last compartment there that literally was dangling at the end. It did not fall into the swirling waters. He told us about that story. But Gary and Mary Jean Chauncey had a wheelchair-ridden little girl, 11 years old. And as they saw her struggling and wanted to know how they could make her escape at the same time, young Andrea with cerebral palsy, tied up in this wheelchair. Neither Gary nor Mary Jean would leave by leaving their girl in that situation. They tried to hoist up that wheelchair. And as the rescuers were swimming in the swirling waters there, trying to get closer and closer, they held her as long as they could, and with one last heave, thrust her into the arms of the rescuers, while both of them lost their lives in the process. That's a supererogatory act against the natural instinct, because the fact of the matter is that little girl could not support herself. The weaker was protected by the stronger, whose life was sacrificed. You see the same thing in Molokai, in Hawaii, where I visited, and saw what Father Joseph Damien did in the rescue of people with leprosy. It's a beautiful island, but plagued by leprosy for many, many years, and Damien came from Belgium, took care of them. When Damien himself contracted leprosy and died, the Belgian government asked for his body to be flown back, and the people in Molokai said, please don't take his body away. We want him to be buried here. He loved us. He took care of us. And the stories are amazing of what Damien did for them. And finally, the Belgian government said, he's one of our heroes. We want him back here. So then they wrote and said, would you do us a favor? Can we cut off his right arm and keep the hand that touched us, that embraced us? And today in Molokai, Damien's right arm is buried as a memorial to the love and the grace that he showed to people who were deemed untouchable. A supererogatory act. But then there comes a second question. If bioscience and all leads us into ethics, the kind that Dennett and all talk about, here's my question for you. I've been to the Middle East many times. I've been on peace missions with religious leadership to talk to both sides of it. Sometimes I would hear answers and it would just crush my spirit and wondered if there was any hope. And when one of those, I shall leave the man unnamed, he was one of the leading part of a violent group out there, founded one of those terrorist groups. And I asked him a question. I can't really tell you what question I asked because it was a private conversation. But the answer that he gave was chilling, absolutely chilling. And I said to him, I can't leave here without responding to you in some way. I'm your guest, but I want to talk to you about this. So here's what I want to say. Listen to me very carefully. In all of our efforts to find some kind of naturalistic explanation for why we must be good, noble, kind, and I'm all for it. And let me put a caveat in here. I'm not for a moment saying that an atheist or a non-theist or an agnostic cannot be a good person. No, no, no. That's not what I'm saying. I've met many good, decent people who don't believe in God. So I'm not accusing the person themselves of not possessing that virtue. I am just saying, how does one bring about a rationally compelling way to defend it? And when people of a different culture arrive at a totally different conclusion culturally and geopolitically, what is the basis of telling them they have no right to come to their conclusion? You see, when Jesus was asked about the laws that were supreme, Moses had given 613 laws. David reduced them to 15. Isaiah brought them down to 11. And then we see going on down that they're brought down further to 6. And then Micah comes up with 3, to do justice, to love mercy, and to walk humbly before your God. When Jesus was asked, what is the greatest commandment? I find it fascinating he didn't answer with 1. He could have done it. He said, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and all your mind and all your soul and all your strength, and your neighbor as yourself. He said, on these 2 laws hang all of the prophets and all of the other laws. You see, because of the first, the second follows. Without the first, the second is with its feet firmly planted in midair. That I am obligated to love my neighbor even with their disagreements of my worldview. I have no right to violate the sacredness of your life, your marriage, your property, and that which you treasure. Neither have you the right to violate the sacredness of my life and my home, my marriage, and my property. I think Jesus is spot on here. To love the Lord your God with all your heart and all your soul and all your mind and all your strength, and to love your neighbor as yourself. On these 2 hang all of the laws and the prophets. And so when we talk about somehow neurologically or biochemically coming out, we are ignoring a vast horde of humanity. I was sitting with 2 young guys from a completely different worldview in Jerusalem. And I have to tell you, we get into these places and they've been very good to me, even if they get rather loud. We'll talk. I've lectured at many, many campuses of a different worldview. And this guy looked at me and he said, let me tell you something. We will first take care of Saturday, then we will take care of Sunday. And I knew exactly what he was saying. That was his law. That was his commitment. And do I come to him and say, biochemically, I don't think you're responding with any sense of nobility here? It may have been my last statement. And I say to you, these counter perspectives are not answering the question. So I close with that and move quickly to my answers here. Viktor Frankl, who was in Auschwitz, said this: if we present man as an automaton of reflexes, as a mind machine, as a bundle of instincts, as a pawn of drives and reactions, as a mere product of heredity and environment, we then feed the nihilism to which modern man is in any case prone. I became acquainted with the last stage of corruption in my second concentration camp, Auschwitz. The gas chambers of Auschwitz were the ultimate consequence of the theory that man is nothing but the product of heredity and environment, or as the Nazis like to say, of blood and soil. I'm absolutely convinced that the gas chambers of Auschwitz, Treblinka, and Meanig were ultimately not prepared in some ministry or other in Berlin, but rather the desks and in the lecture halls of nihilistic scientists and philosophers. Franco. And I bring to you that that is where one ultimately gets off, when you lose the essential value of human life and the transcendent moral order. Bertrand Russell paid the Christian worldview the ultimate compliment without even thinking about it. His quotation stands outside Mahatma Gandhi's home. And by the way, Gandhi traveled with the New Testament in his pocket all of his life, quoted from the Sermon on the Mount repeatedly. And Gandhi, as he fought for the freedom of his own people, Bertrand Russell says this incredibly, that's on a banner outside Gandhiji's home. Here's what it says: "It is doubtful that the Mahatma would have succeeded, except that he was appealing to the conscience of a Christianized people." Here's an atheist complimenting the success of a pantheist because of the moral values of a theist. Fascinating. So, where do we go from the Christian point of view? I give you 6 thoughts, 1 or 2 I'll elaborate on, some I'll keep brief. Number 1, God is the author of life. God is the author of life. We can spend all of our time on the method used and the manner used and the time and all of that. My point to you right now is, however you move directionally, and I've known Christians on many sides of this. Our colleague at Oxford, John Lennox, has written a powerful book. Here's a man with a triple doctorate in science who's written a book called 7 Days That Divide the World. What I say to you is, the source of my value is given to me by God. I have that intrinsic value for life. You know, as I talk to you, I've become a grandfather 3 times in the last couple of years. Our youngest one's about 2 months old. And I was talking to Vince as we were driving in here. My daughter is terribly concerned because of a serial respiratory viral infection that she has contracted in the last 48 hours. And my daughter spent the last night in the hospital and today all day with the doctor. And here's my daughter, wee little thing herself, she and her husband, with this little baby that came home at 5 pounds and 10 ounces. Tiny little one. And all of a sudden, here now at the 2-month age, gets this viral infection probably and beginning to lose weight, which she can hardly afford to lose. And I watch the love of a mother and hear the voice on the phone of how dearly she cares for this little one. Dad, please pray for me. Please pray with me. This is very hard for me to watch my little one going through this. Every life has intrinsic value and worth. And it behooves us to reach out to the weakest and the littlest ones among us. There is that mystery of life. There is an author. If there is an author, there is a script and there is a story. That's the second thing I give to you. That there is a storyline. And once you understand the storyline, it explains the contingencies. I remember when I was first unaware of the story of the Phantom of the Opera. And I'd be driving around and listening to that music and I'd say, why on earth is this guy screaming? There's not music. Go, what music is this? Yeah, I know operas, you can grovel and all of that, I know that, but this was really not musical. You watch the play, and it's some of the most magnificent music that Andrew Lloyd Webber has put together. Both the screams and the beautiful tones are understandable in the light of the story. Once you get the script, once you understand the story, you begin to understand what it is that God brings together here. Now I want you to follow me. Time's running out, so I have to give this to you as briefly as I can. Where there is freedom, there is the possibility of love. Where there is love, there's a possibility of pain. Where there is pain, there's a possibility of a Savior. Where there is a Savior, there's a possibility of redemption. Where there is redemption, there is a possibility of restoration. Freedom makes love possible. Love makes pain possible. Pain makes the Savior possible. And the Savior brings redemption, and the redemption brings restoration. I have seen this again and again and again demonstrated in life. My colleague Matt, who travels with me, will tell you. Just a few months ago, May of this year, I was in Manila in the Philippines, and unknown to me, a very prominent person in the country stood up at the end of my talk and walked up to the microphone, standing about 6'3" or so, handsome-looking guy, and his tears running down his face. He said, "You're talking about meaning, purpose." He said, "I don't have it." He said, "I'm living with three things: pain, shame, and guilt." Pain, shame, and guilt. How can you help me? I didn't even know he was an actor, but I said to him, "You know, you're a made-for-the-movies kind of guy." And I said, "You talk about meaninglessness." When we were driving back that night, I saw his face all over the billboards everywhere. He told me his story. He was a playboy in private, living a totally debauched life, and a drug addict to the core. Well-known film actor. If I named him, anybody here who comes from the Philippines will know exactly whom I'm talking about. I probably don't even need to name him. He was living this duplicitous, horrid life, videoed himself in all of his exploits. Somebody broke into his apartment, took all of those videos, put it on YouTube. He was branded the most hated man in the Philippines. So he comes to me, opens up, bows his head, and gives his life to Christ. He says, "I have a request to ask you." He said, "Ravi, please, can I travel with you as much as possible over the next several months? I just want to learn." So he's been covering all of the globe with us. Came to Indonesia, came to Singapore, came to Los Angeles a couple of weeks ago, and Malaysia, India, so on. A week ago he writes to me. I could read his letter to you. I wept when I read it, and I sent it to my colleagues in the team. He said, "I want to tell you, when I came back to the Philippines, I wasn't expecting to see the terrible devastation." He said, "I've taken my valuables and I have auctioned them off. I'm raising money, and we've raised quite a bit. I'm personally going to fly out to help the suffering and the wounded and try to bring some meaning and help and hope into their lives." A few months ago, he was plundering people. Now, he writes a letter, and I say to myself, my goodness, what a story. What a script. The story is this. What is it? Number 3, that life is sacred. Life is sacred. And may I say this to you, the problem in the Christian life and the gospel is not that we are not moral. The problem really is that we are dead. We are dead to God. And Christ didn't come into this world to make bad people good. He came to make dead people live.